Hi, everyone. Welcome to the December 2023 Ask Me Anything session hosted by RentPrep.com. I'm Andrew Schultz, community manager here at RentPrep. I'm also a licensed real estate broker with over 15 years of experience in the property management and rental property industries. Got a couple of guests with me here today. We have Josh and Carlos, both from RentPrep. Josh is the marketing manager and Carlos is the business development manager. Josh, how are you doing today?
I am good, Andrew. It is, as I always do, I'll give you my update from Buffalo here as far as weather goes. There is no snow yet.
Yeah.
So we are looking to have a green Christmas for those that don't live in the Buffalo area. It looks like it's going to be about 50 degrees on Christmas Day in Buffalo. So
And last year for Christmas, we had 7 foot of snow.
yeah, a little bit different than last year.
Very different scenario this year versus last year.
I'm doing well. The Bills won yesterday too, so I'm fired up about that and excited that we've got Carlos on here to join us for December.
Absolutely. Carlos is the business development manager over at RentPrep. He's joining us for the AMA today. Carlos, how are you doing?
I'm doing great as well. You know, Bills won. Sabres are kind of up and down, but our Bandits, our world champions, won also on Saturday. So,
you know what?
Pretty good sports weekend.
I've never been to a Bandits game, but I really feel like I need to because I feel like that's like the franchise to support in Buffalo. Everybody that I know is a Bandits fan, and I've never made it out to a lacrosse game.
Yeah, it's my first season. I just decided to get season tickets, so we're enjoying that. It's a family thing now, so it's good times.
Seasons are pretty reasonable for the Bandits too, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Much more approachable than Sabres or Bills or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right.
So, let's see. Let's recap. Let me pull this up real quick. We'll drop a quick notice in here or a quick go watch our videos type thing. Latest video on the YouTube page is best holiday gifts for landlords and contractors. That's a pretty good list. I've compiled that list together. A lot of that stuff is meant to be stuff that can be used by either an on the tools landlord, if you will, somebody that's inside the day-to-day operations, or a contractor that's out working on a day-to-day basis. A lot of good gift ideas in there. And then our next video coming up, we're going to be talking about New Year's resolutions for rental property owners. We're talking about some of the things that people tend to want to correct in the new year and how you can go about starting the new year off on a right foot. So we're pretty excited about that. And then our last podcast episode was 419, which was on smart home technology, talking to an applicant's references for when screening an apartment and talking about how to manage your keys for your rentals. So quite a bit of good content out there. We got a lot of good stuff coming up in 2024 as well. We're pretty excited about that. I think that's everything I needed to cover.
Yeah, no, I think we've got another large list of questions submitted as we kind of round out the year here. So let's not waste any more time here and let's jump in. I'll start with the form submission question. All right, question from Maxine. So the timeline for eviction notice, example, if due on the 1st, late on the 5th, dates and forms to start the process. So Maxine is saying timeline for an eviction notice.
Looks like she's trying to start an eviction. Yeah. So this is going to be state dependent. And unfortunately, I don't know what state Maxine is in. I'm going to give you the example for here in New York. So in New York State, it's considered rent's due on the 1st or whatever date is specified in the lease. The tenant has 5 days after that period to make their rent payment without a late fee. So they can make their rent payment anytime between the 1st and the 5th with no late fee. Midnight on the 6th, the late fee applies. And then that's also the point where we can begin our 5-day notice process and our 14-day notice process, which are the 2 notices that you need to send before you can start an eviction proceeding here in New York. One of them is a, hey, your rent is late notice. And the other one is, here's an itemized list of charges. We're going to court if you don't pay this in 14 days. And at that point, we go and file the docket in the courthouse and it kind of proceeds from there. But that is the start of the process here in New York. As far as timeline goes, again, that's another thing that's going to be very, very state and really municipality specific. So for instance, here in Buffalo right now, prior to 2019, when HSTPA went into place, we could do an eviction from beginning of the paperwork to tenant set out in 60 days. And we just had a set out on an eviction this morning. Today is December 18th. We started that eviction in July. July 6th is when we sent the paperwork on that.
Oh, wow.
So these timelines now are much, much different than what they used to be, for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of new legislation that's been passed that judges have to abide by. Also, landlords have to abide by. There's been a large number of evictions that were postponed as a result of COVID that we're still kind of working through, in my opinion. And of course, now we're also in the winter season, and courts seem reluctant to set tenants out around the holidays. So again, that's another reason. So what used to be a 60-day process for us can now lead up to 6 months. Just depends on the unique situation around whatever particular unit we're trying to do an eviction on. But our shortest eviction now is like 3.5 or 4 months. It's a very lengthy process. It's not what it used to be, unfortunately.
That is crazy.
Yeah, it's a real disservice because you're not helping anyone, really. The landlord is taking a massive loss on the rent. The outgoing tenant is obviously still going to have to move when all's said and done, and they're going to lose their security deposit and probably not move all of their stuff. So they're going to lose a bunch of stuff in the process. The upheaval of moving is a pain in and of itself. Like but the way it's working out right now, it's certainly not in the landlord's favor. Eviction's kind of a last case scenario for anybody anyway. And to be at a point now where not only is it a last case scenario, but it's also going to take you potentially 6 months to get your unit back. That's a rough situation.
Yeah, that is no good. And I know we talked about it a little bit last time, but RentPrep does have a very general eviction cost calculator that is on the RentPrep site. It figures in factors like potential legal fees, the time to turn the property, all that kind of stuff, and gives you a rough estimate of what. And obviously, all this stuff is based on location and the situation and all that. But it does give you a little bit of a rough estimate as far as what you could be looking for, as far as costs go, if you do have to execute an eviction. And
you're right. You do lose from a few different perspectives. It's not just the lost rent. It's also the court costs, which is a hard expense. You have to pay that. It's also the cost of having the marshal service come out and remove the tenant from the property. It's also the cost of changing the locks on the property. It's also the cost of removing all of the debris or storing it. In some areas, you actually have to move all of their stuff to storage and pay for the storage and hold it for a certain length of time. Then dispose of it after all that. And then you still have to turn over the unit, which is probably going to have some substantial damage to it. If somebody is bent out of shape because they're being evicted, they're very likely to, do a lot of damage on the way out the door.
Property poorly.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. So it's frustrating for sure. That's a tough situation.
Yeah. And I think that's a good segue into one of our next questions, just surrounding screening. Let's field this one from Marcy. So I was looking at the RentPrep site and saw 2 different packages offered. I'm wondering which one you would recommend, which items are the best to use. Kind of just a general. It looks like Marcy was on the site and just came across both products. So I think this is a good one for Carlos to kind of jump in here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Josh. So as Marcy said, we have 2 different packages that are on the RentPrep site. We offer a RentPrep background check, and then we also offer a Smart Move TransUnion report. The difference between the two is not just going to be what you're getting in the report, but the workflow itself. The tenants or the TransUnion report is typically going to be for those landlords or property managers that are not essentially gathering all of the information right out the gates, specifically like PII, which is like social security numbers, date of births, and so on. It's also designed for those individuals that want the applicant to fill that information out, authenticate their identity for TransUnion, but also give them the ability, meaning the end user or landlord or property manager, to view an actual credit report. So if you're looking for a raw credit report, the TransUnion full credit report is going to be your option. There is going to be an additional step, which is going to include the applicant authenticating their identity by asking 3 out of all the questions. Once they do that, At that point, depending on who paid for the report, whether it's the landlord or the tenant, based on the state, location, that'll complete the token and send the information back to the landlord. There is going to be an add-on for that report, which is the judgments and liens. The reason being is because judgments and liens no longer appear on credit reports. So, in certain cases, like in New York, I was going to ask Andrew, how do you combat being in a state that doesn't allow you to view evictions on a background check? Do you take advantage of a judgments and liens to see if maybe, the landlord has maybe not gone through the eviction process, still got the tenant out, but still filed a judgment and small claims for past due rent?
I believe judgments and liens are added to all of our reports. I would have to double check on that. Realistically speaking, typically what we find is we can't look at eviction data anymore. So that's completely off the table. We're not even allowed to pull up e-courts technically to look into a situation like that. So what we have found is that most tenants, we find something else that doesn't add up while we're going through their application.
Sure.
And a lot of times that will clue us in that we're looking at an application that either has falsified data or incomplete data or something like that. More often than not, while trying to do the landlord verification and the income verification, and then running the credit and background check, we get that list of addresses on the credit and background check. And if something is missing from the application, we ask the tenant the question and then start digging from there. So it's a little bit tougher here in New York without having access to the eviction data. I think that was a real bad move by New York State, but
sure.
What do I know? I only work in the industry.
So Marcy, I hope that answered your question. If you're looking for a raw credit report, the Smart Move is definitely going to be the way to go. If you're looking for more financial background and have the ability to order a decision report, which is offered on the RentPrep side, that is not going to give you the actual score itself. It's going to give you a range. So prior to you ordering, when you create your account, it's going to ask you what is your minimum criteria for a credit score. What will happen is when the report is returned back to you, it's going to give you a range, so that way you have an idea whether or not they hit the mark, but you're not going to get the actual score itself. So they're two different reports based on two different workflows. I'm a fan of RentPrep background check, and the reason being is because of their criminal. I feel that the criminal report on the RentPrep background check side digs a little bit deeper versus the TransUnion. I know that the RentPrep background check, that's where the FCRA certified screeners are actually going to be hand compiling the reports. And with that, they have the ability to maneuver through multiple databases to ensure that accuracy versus TransUnion. TransUnion is created in TransUnion. We're just generating the report and sending that back through. So, TransUnion is a great product. Don't get me wrong. If you're looking for that raw score, or I'm sorry, the raw credit report with that resident score. But if you're really honed in on things like your criminal background, then I would lean more towards the RentPrep background check.
Yeah, that was good. Looking at the Facebook Live, it looks like Linda is reaching out to you, Carlos. Linda's wondering where your antlers that you wore for the holidays, was it last year or 2 years ago?
I think it was last year.
Maybe last year. Yeah, no, I clip them every year. So and because the snow's not dropping, I don't know. I think it has something to do with the weather. So I'm hopefully in January, February, I'll get the antlers going again.
Oh, that's so funny. We were just talking about that earlier.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to one. Let's bounce over to Facebook here. Let's do this quick one from Kip. Kip asks, do you require your tenants to keep you updated if they change jobs?
We don't, no. So, and actually, I'm glad that this question popped up because it's leads me to a little bit larger question, and that is, should you rescreen tenants between leases? And that's going to be like a individualized business decision, I think, depending on how you want to run your business. But I can tell you that we don't rescreen in between tenancies unless there's a change to the people who are going to be on the lease. So if somebody's moving out, somebody else is moving in, we're going to do an application on the new person so that we have all that stuff on file prior to generating the new lease with the new names and stuff on it. But as far as going back through and rescreening tenants after they've already moved in, we generally don't. As a matter of fact, I had a situation where I signed the lease on an apartment on a Wednesday and was laid off on a Friday. So like it happens. Tenant screening is literally a snapshot in time. And that's something to keep in mind when you're screening tenants is there's nothing that says that tenant doesn't qualify on Monday, lose their job on Wednesday and not qualify anymore. So it's definitely something to consider.
Is there anything available that allows a property manager or a landlord to not only take a look at a prospect's past, but have a glimpse into their current state or even future state?
It's in terms of
it's a loaded question. Finances.
Not really, I don't think.
How do you feel about the income verification report, giving you the real-time available?
I like the income verification report. The only problem I have with any kind of an income verification report or something that goes in, and because that also pulls down the account balances and stuff like that.
Yeah.
We've had more than one circumstance where someone has contacted us and said, hey, I need an apartment. I just got a bunch of settlement money. I don't have a traditional income, but I have the settlement money.
Sure.
Okay, that's great. But you having that settlement money doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to pay the rent if you go out and blow all that settlement money in 3 months' time. So we do have a mechanism in our tenant screening for situations where someone has non-traditional income. Basically, they have to prove that they have had 12 months of rent on deposit for a 12-month period prior to moving into the apartment. So essentially, we want to know, yes, you have money and you've had money for a couple minutes. Sure. And you're demonstrating some ability to not go out and blow all the money in a short period of time over the course of a year at least. So that does work. That's kind of a nice way to complement the income verification report that RentPrep offers. But as far as going back and like double checking with tenants to make sure that they're still employed and stuff like that, or changing job, we don't go through and rescreen tenants once they've been placed. Carlos, do you have that happen a lot? Do you have a lot of landlords that will go through and rescreen? Because I think you probably see more of it on the business development side.
So with the I'm involved in the higher volume clients, more of the communities, 500 doors and so on and so forth. I do see it from time to time where I do have clients that will do a rescreen, and when they do a rescreen, the enterprise side allows those clients to create almost an a la carte or a custom product configuration. So in those cases, they're going to run very minimal information. I typically see either a credit with sex offender search, or I'll see that with the income verification report, and that is it. But they're not going through the judgments, they're not doing the credit, they're not doing the evictions, obviously, they're not doing the judge. It's just those two pieces. They want to make sure the community is still safe, nothing happened in the last year where maybe somebody's on parole or probation or whatever the case is, that would maybe necessarily or disqualify them from living in that community or renewing that lease. And then that income verification report, they just want to make sure that the 30, 60, 90-day balance meets their criteria, and that they do have more than a couple nickels to rub together in the account. It's rare.
Yeah,
it is rare.
It's interesting that you mentioned the 30, 60, 90-day window, because I forgot actually that the income verification reports give you that information, which is nice to have. Sure. Do you have clients that actually use that as part of their screening criteria?
I could count them on one hand.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say, because that's not something that we're currently looking at. So I was wondering if maybe there was a shift that I hadn't heard about yet.
Yeah. No, it's just like I said, I can count them on one hand. But it's very rare that happens. But they're still doing it. It's still available.
Yeah.
Are you able to rescreen midway through a lease? Or say for some reason, like a special circumstance came up, or maybe somebody you start to notice that maybe somebody's not able to pay the rent on time all the time after maybe being good for 6 months, and you notice, oh, well, that one was late last month. Well, now it's late again.
Right.
What's kind of going on here? Is that ever a situation? And I don't have as many properties, so I don't ever come across it. But I was just wondering, Andrew, just from your experience, has anybody just rescreened and ran an income verification, and there's a vast change in
So we do have that ability. So on our application, when the applicant signs off, they're actually signing off not only for the current credit and background check, but future credit and background checks if their application is approved.
Got it.
And I think that that is actually in our lease as well. That said, I've never actually gone back and run like rescreened a tenant prior to starting an eviction action or something like that.
Right.
Typically, if we're at a point where we're talking to a tenant about, hey, your rent's been late the past few months, blah, 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 we're either moving toward a cash for keys offer, or we're moving toward it's time for you to go because we're going to evict you type of situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just curious. All right, let's go back to the form submission questions. Carlos, I wanted to actually jump to this one because it kind of pertained to what Marcy had asked before. So this question's from Ron. Ron's asking, upon reviewing the packages and pricing in the RentPrep site, I observed the judgments and liens are not included on the full credit report. And is it advisable to add judgments and liens for an extra cost, or would it be more practical to opt into the RentPrep background check? So kind of, we answered a little bit of this just as far as the product goes, but just wanted to hear your thoughts.
No, I look at it from a business standpoint. When you're talking about the TransUnion credit report for $40, and there's a $7 add-on for the judgments and liens, yes, it brings your package up to $47. I look at that as a very, very small investment or insurance that gives you, a little bit of better information, so that way, you're making the right decision. There's nothing worse than not or trying to save $7 for that particular search, and then 3 or 4 months from now, deficiency happens, they stop paying rent, whatever the case is, for whatever reason you stumble upon that they have a track record of this. The evictions didn't show up because like Andrew had just mentioned, cash for keys is starting to become bigger and bigger, and the reason being, your average landlord is not is trying to mitigate their risk as much as possible. They'd rather lose maybe $3,000 in rent versus 6, 7, 8,000 in the eviction process. So what they're doing is they're finding a middle ground here, figuring out a way to get the tenant out, and trying to keep the place somewhat respectable as far in terms of damages, and they're getting the judgments for the past due rent. So to answer the question, Ron, 100%. I would do everything I can to get as much information within the eyes of both, the federal and state regulations to make a decision. This is your investment. And what you don't want to do is pinch pennies before you even give somebody the keys. Because once you do that, Andrew probably can attest to it, that's it. It's too late. You're already going up the roller coaster. And the only way, you got to go through the whole ride from start to finish for the most part. So definitely do that. When it comes to the debating between the two packages, again, it just comes down to preference. Are you looking for that raw credit report? If so, you definitely want to go with that TransUnion credit report with the add-on. If you're not really honed in on that and you're really looking for the judgments, liens, the evictions, and you want to maybe throw in the credit decision because you're okay with, well, at least let me know if they hit my minimum, then yeah, you definitely want to go for that RentPrep side. Again, I'm an advocate of the RentPrep background check. I think it gives for what I try to do with my criteria, it gives me the information I need. I necessarily don't need to look at every single line of credit that the person has. I'm looking for derogatory remarks, and aside from bankruptcy, you have to get those additional searches in order for you to view that information.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile. I mean, anytime you're talking about tenant screening, I mentioned earlier, it's a snapshot in time. So trying to gather as much information as you can during that time is crucial to making decisions.
Sure.
And I don't love the fact that states are starting to strip away the information that we can use to make decisions. I think that it kind of ties a landlord's hand behind their back. Like you said, you were about to turn over a very expensive asset to someone that you've met maybe 2 or 3 times for a grand total of an hour, if you're lucky,
right.
Like depending on how long your showing times are and stuff like that. And you're getting ready to turn over in many instances, multi-hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of asset to someone with a signature and a check for a couple $1,000s. So tenant screening is certainly not the time to cut expenses for sure.
Exactly.
Like tenant screening is one of those things that you do it consistently, do it the right way every time, use a set of fair housing compliant criteria when you're screening, and make sure you're gathering as much data as you can.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. All right. Question from Kim. We're in Missouri and have two triplexes on one gravel lot. My question is in regards to how to plan for winter. I feel it's reasonable to have each renter be responsible for the ice/snow removal for their own doors. Not really worried about the driveway as very little accumulation. Do I need to add an addendum? Would appreciate some feedback. Thanks.
So you should definitely specify in your lease who's responsible for snow and what they're responsible for. So we actually have a section in our lease for lawns, snow, and landscaping, who's responsible and what are the expectations. And typically our rule in Buffalo, or our rule at Own Buffalo, is if it's a triplex, we set up snow service, because once we get to 3 doors, it seems to be people don't just go out and take care of it. They stop.
Yeah.
So anything 3 doors or more, we talk to property owners. We get a plow service set up for driveways and shovel service set up for sidewalks and stoops and stuff like that. If it's a situation where it kind of sounds like this is almost like townhouse or row house type setup where everybody has their own separate entrance, I don't think I would be opposed to making the tenants responsible for taking care of their own like stoop, if you will. If it's truly their stoop and they're the only ones on it. As far as the parking area goes, though, what state did she say she's in? Missouri? I don't know how much snow Missouri gets, but I would make sure that you have a plan for the driveway as well, either a plow service or something. I don't know. Maybe plow services aren't a thing in Missouri. I've never been to Missouri. I don't know anything about the state or the weather there. But if it's a situation where you might find yourself in a situation where you're going to have a bunch of snow and you've got 2 triplexes, so that sounds like at least 6 cars that need to be, sounds like it's going to be a decent size area. It's not something you're going to want to be out there shoveling or snow blowing or something like that. So maybe look around, see if you can get a plow service lined up, even for just those emergency situations where there is accumulation, because it's going to be a situation where your tenants are going to be looking to you regardless of what else is going on. I can almost guarantee it, especially if it's not in your lease. That said, you did ask about an addendum for winter weather. Yeah, definitely get a lease addendum in place with all of your tenants as to who's responsible for what for winter weather. And honestly, expect some pushback because you're making changes to a lease that's already been signed and you're trying to make it as you're going into the winter season. So it's not something where the tenants are not thinking about it. It's something where they're going to be thinking about it very vividly because the snow, whatever snow there may be in Missouri, they're going to be thinking about the fact that they now have to deal with that. So it's something that you might get a little bit of pushback on, especially given the time of year that you're trying to approach them on it.
Does potentially adding that, tenant is responsible for walkway or stoop, whatever you want to call it, does adding that to the lease potentially protect you? And I know we can't give legal advice, but does that potentially protect you from, say, somebody has a slip and fall or, exiting the unit?
I mean, in New York State, they practice shotgun law. They shoot everybody and see who bleeds is basically how it works in New York State. So I would get dragged into a lawsuit. The property owner would get dragged into a lawsuit. Yeah. If we had a plow service set up for that property, they would get dragged into a lawsuit. So that's in New York State, that's pretty much how it would go. How would the court find? I would think that if we were able to bring a lease in that says, hey, this is the tenant's responsibility, and the tenant didn't, take care of it, I think that would probably provide some avenue for relief, but I don't know how far that would really get you. When you've limited your contractual obligations or passed a contractual obligation off to another party. So that's a better question for an attorney or an insurance agent, somebody who's been through that a couple of times. I'm very fortunate in that I've not yet had any, I'm going to knock on wood real quick. I've not had any slip and fall accidents that have required anything beyond some salt, essentially.
Yeah. Just curious. I know one of the apartments that I had years back, just, it was a complex. So there was multiple doors on there, and there were, there's a range of ages in that complex. And, you had elderly people, working professionals, all that kind of stuff. And then even back in the days was college years for me. So young. But I always wondered that because we had, we had some areas that were wicked slippery with ice and just crazy. And I know they would just leave buckets of salt next to
Mhm.
the entrance door just for, maintain it when it gets bad.
Yeah,
So I
we
was
do the
always
same.
curious about that. Yeah.
Yeah, we do the same on our properties where we have services set up for snow. We also leave buckets with salt,
Yeah.
and it doesn't hurt. What does it cost to throw a bucket of salt in front of a building? 10, 10, 15 bucks.
Right.
It's, and if it helps, even if a tenant just happens to say, oh, I'm going to pre-salt today because we're supposed to get snow. Great. I would rather you pre-salt than,
Hmm.
salt's cheap as far as I'm concerned. I would rather you pre-salt rather than let ice build up on a building. So
Right. For sure. All right. Another form question here. A question from Todd. I'm a property owner with 20 units in PA and having listened to you guys for a while. What's up, Todd? I have been firming up my tenant background checks for new tenancy. What do you do if you have multiple applicants, i.e., from an open house that submit the same day and meet the benchmark criteria? Can you choose which one to offer the lease to? And if so, what do you say in the adverse action letter? My concern is a lawsuit that denies a qualified applicant.
Time. What'd you think, Andrew? If you have three people coming into the property, they're not all coming in together as a group if they don't know each other, I would assume. And they all fill out the application, they all pass the pre-screening criteria. I would think that if you had a timestamp on when they actually came in, if you're trying to do everything by the book, you start at who came in first.
Well, it depends on the state. So
Mm.
in some states, and I
This is
actually did not load Todd's question into the StreamYard software today because I meant to go research it, and then I didn't have time to research before we hopped on here. There are some states where the requirement is first approvable application gets the apartment. Fortunately, it's not many states, but double check your state and make sure that see if you are or are not in that rule. Because in some states, it's literally the first approvable application. As soon as you get through the screening on it, once it's approvable, you have to accept that application. All the other applications get denied. In other states, it is you have to process them in order of receipt. So applicant A, then applicant B, then applicant C in that order. And in other states, it's pick what you want. And as to the best of my knowledge, at least here in New York, we're still a pick what you want state. So I could, in theory, have multiple approved applications and pick the best of the three. Generally speaking, we don't wind up with multiple approved applications at the same time. So it's pretty infrequent that something like this would happen to us, but occasionally it does happen, just as that's the way paperwork falls and stuff like that. We have the ability here in New York to pick best qualified candidate. So that's the route that I would go. But you do have to double check your state laws and see, it might even be a municipal law that says, hey, you have to pick based on receipt, based on best qualified, or based on time of receipt, best qualified, or order of receipt. Order of completion, rather.
Nice.
So yeah, there's a couple different ways to look at that.
Yeah.
Multiple applicants, same day, meet the benchmark criteria. I don't know what the rule is in Pennsylvania, Todd. Unfortunately, thanks for watching. I appreciate that, but unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you on what the rule is in Pennsylvania. From my perspective, I'm always going to choose the best qualified candidate if that's the option that I'm given. So in New York State, where we don't have, and I'm kind of surprised that we don't have, again, I'll knock on wood, kind of surprised that we don't have a piece of legislation that dictates how we're supposed to process rental applications. So I have the ability to always choose best qualified. So that's the route that I go.
Nice. Okay. Facebook question from from Harvey. I have a rental single family house. A single woman, elderly, has been there for 14 years. I decided to sell the property. I went in for an inspection. The entire house is trashed. She was doing a cat rescue. She had 10 cats. I would say $50,000 in damages. She has till September 15th to vacate. How do you go about holding the tenant liable or her liable for damages? She has always paid rent. Is a lawyer my only option?
With $50,000 worth of damages, you have to pursue this in civil court. Depending on the state, small claims caps out at 2,500 or 5,000. I think there's a couple states where it might even be 10. But at 50 grand, you have to go to civil court for a matter like this.
Yeah.
In some states, you'll be able to represent yourself. In other states, you'll be required to hire an attorney. I know in New York State, if you have your property in some sort of a corporate structure, like an LLC or a corporation, then you have to hire an attorney. You can no longer represent yourself on behalf of the corporation. You have to hire an attorney for those. I'm pretty sure that you can represent yourself in a civil case in New York State. I don't know if the court recommends against it or not, but for a situation like this, I mean, this is one where you're basically going to go in and show this is what it looked like when she moved in. This is what it looks like now. Granted, she's been there for 14 years, but what we're seeing is obviously beyond reasonable wear and tear. I'm assuming there's going to be photos of, damages from cat claws and probably some damages from pet waste and things of that nature. All of that stuff in court counts as evidence. And I don't think it would be real hard to win this case. But winning, it's only step one. Then you have to collect on it. And that's the much more difficult part. Depending on the tenant, if they are what we refer to as professional tenants, where they basically bounce from place to place to place, you're never going to collect any money from them. They're never going to have the money to collect from. So in that instance, you're probably not even in a position where taking it to civil court makes any sense. Yeah, you're going to get a judgment. You're going to get a piece of paper that's valid for 10 years that says that this person owes you money, but you're never, ever going to get the money. Not unless that person goes through a major life change and gets to a point where they want to buy houses or cars or something like that, where the liens and judgments would pop up on their credit report. And honestly, I don't even know if like car dealerships do lien and judgment reports anymore. But that's when you're going to wind up getting paid, is when that person's doing something and wants to improve their life and they have to get over you as a hurdle to get to the next step. So it is an option. It's not going to be fun. I feel bad for you that there's been $50,000 worth of damages done to the property. Hopefully this woman is in a position where she can pay some of it, all of it, get on a payment plan, something, but that's a rough situation to find yourself in for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Let's bounce back to the form submission question. We've got a question from Rico. What benefits and drawbacks come with choosing a comprehensive property management solution compared to assembling a customized tech stack with individual property management tools?
So my recommendation is to do both. You're never going to find a property management software that will do all of the things that you want it to do. All of them seem to do one or two things really, really well. And then the other service offerings are kind of weak. So for instance, we're using AppFolio for our property management business, and it works relatively well, but it sucks at applications and tenant screening, which is why we use the RentPrep software. It sucks at maintenance management. It's gotten a little better on maintenance management, but not where we wanted it to be. So we use Monday for that. We use Z Inspector for our property inspections, which is, there's a plugin for that in AppFolio that we don't use. So you're never going to find a tech stack. You're never going to find a single piece of property management software that does all of the things that you need it to do really, really well. It doesn't exist. Right. Spend a lot of time researching your core property management software. That's where you should spend probably the bulk of your time, because that's where everything needs to be able to come in and out of. My recommendation is find something that has an open API or something that is integrated with other softwares that you're looking to use in your tech stack. So for instance, up until 2023, AppFolio really didn't have any outside integrations. We were stuck with just their software, which made it very, very difficult to build a tech stack around. Now there are some integrations with things like Z Inspector and some other softwares, so that it makes the process a lot easier. But definitely, if you're going to be looking into tech stack solutions, start with your base software. Make sure that it has open API access, or that you can get your data out of it easily. And if in the event that you might want to change softwares, and then look at the rest of your tech stack and see what that does to support, number one, your operation, and then number two, your other pieces of software. That's probably the best advice I can give. This is something that we've been looking at a lot lately because we're going to be moving away from our current property management software into something different. So we're looking at all sorts of things as to how it's going to impact our tech stack and stuff like that. But yeah, there's definitely no such thing as a like a soup to nuts full service property management software, in my opinion. They all lack something.
Right. Carlos, any thoughts?
No, I was just going to say I couldn't agree more. Nothing against Appfolio. There's a ton of them out there. You have Buildium, Yardi, Entrata. In my world, it comes down to, the actual tenant screening process. What differentiates what we do versus what these all-in-ones typically offer.
Mm-hmm.
And like Andrew has said, some of the stuff works great, other stuff doesn't work as well. I can tell you what specifically when it comes to tenant screening, majority of these all-in-one platforms are plugged into single databases. There's no QA behind it. Sometimes you're going to be guessing on whether or not this is even the right individual. If for whatever reason the social security number gets inputted incorrectly, whether it's from you or your tenant, in a lot of different circumstances, I've talked to clients that said, you're going to get a report back and it's not even the right person. So, trying to get a refund on that. So this is where we come into play. RentPrep is pretty much the source. We're the middleman between the data providers and our clients. We are integrated in software like Yardi. So if you are on the Yardi platform, we're integrated with their Voyager series. They also have smaller accounts for those that are like on Buildium and Appfolio that want to explore Yardi. Yardi is a great software. I think they're doing it really well, but again, that particular platform gives you the ability to kind of build what you're trying to achieve. It'll start out with who do you want for your applications and who do you want for your tenant screening, and it'll give you the approved vendors that's within the ecosystem, and then it's kind of like plug and play. So it's really nice versus like Appfolio. They were closed API, meaning data providers or vendors like RentPrep we weren't allowed to integrate with Appfolio. Appfolio offered whatever they offered, and that's what you got. Yes, they have the Appfolio Plus now, but they're going to pick and choose. And I can tell you right now that tenant screening is not one of the APIs that they're allowing to integrate because they have their own tenant screening, and they would be losing revenue at that point, so it wouldn't make sense. But
Question on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Has their tenant screening improved since they settled that massive lawsuit?
No.
Okay. And that's all we need to say about it, really. I mean, if anybody wants more information, just go Google it. But that was something that had an impact on our business because of the software vendors that we use. So
we have a lot of larger clients that still utilize Appfolio, Buildium, these all-in-ones, Entradas, but they have identified that tenant screening is lacking because there are so many different variables. The customer service isn't there when it's needed, particularly for that particular data set. Again, that's a really nice thing about the RentPrep. Yeah, you're going to sacrifice, if you want to call it efficiency, but it's just trying to figure out a different workflow, making an adjustment. Because again, like Andrew has mentioned earlier, I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollar assets here. And if you need to take an additional step that's going to maybe, take another hour or two to help mitigate that risk, you owe it to yourself.
And especially if it sounds like Rico might be a third-party property manager, not only do you owe it to yourself, you owe it to your clients too.
Absolutely.
You have a fiduciary responsibility at that point. So
absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Question from Jared. Curious if anyone had any strategies for month-to-month rentals that discourage renters staying only a few months. Looking to rent out our old primary home, but don't want to run the risk of locking in a 12-month lease if a tenant turns out to not be so great. I also want to encourage or discourage very short rental terms. Does anyone have any lease structures that get the best of both worlds, potential lease longevity with ability to remove a problem tenant?
You're trying to have it all, Jared. You can have a term lease, or you can have a month-to-month lease. And by term lease, I mean, 6 months, 1 year, whatever. Or you can have flexibility. So which do you prefer? And I think that's the real question here is, do you prefer to have the flexibility of maybe not having to deal with the tenant for a long term if they're a bad tenant? And by the way, just because it's a month-to-month rental, and you give that tenant a termination of tenancy notice, doesn't mean that tenant's going to move at the end of the month when they're supposed to. So a month-to-month rental, a lease is only as good as the paper that it's written on and the people that signed it. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, if you have a tenant that you're not happy with and you have them on a month-to-month lease and you issue a termination of tenancy notice, if they don't move at the end of the month, you're still back in the same boat. You still have to go through the full eviction process. Right. So it really doesn't matter to me if the lease is 3 months, 6 months, a year long, or if it's month to month. At the end of that lease term, and more than likely something's going to wind up happening with this tenant where you're going to be able to get a lease violation written up, even if you are on a 1-year lease. There's going to be some kind of a lease violation, which is why you're looking to get rid of them. So at that point, I would just pursue the lease violation route if you have a term lease and not a month-to-month lease, because the end result's still the same. You're going to wind up in court dealing with the headaches. And from that perspective, I honestly don't know as though it really matters if you do a month-to-month lease or if you do a term lease. We've gotten to a point here where if a tenant contacts us and says, hey, I need to move, I lost my job, I want to move back in with my parents, whatever, okay, I have 2 options. I can let this tenant out of the apartment. I can get control of the asset back. I can get the apartment cleaned up and get it released, which is the best case scenario for my investor. Or I can tell this tenant, nope, you're responsible for this lease. We can drag this out for months, going through an eviction process once she's missed a rent payment, drag it for, we just talked about in New York State, it might be 6 months before you get that eviction. That's why I'm bigger on the cash for keys scenarios and scenarios that get the asset back under your control quicker. And in a scenario like I just described, where somebody needs to move, technically in New York State, they should be liable for the rent and the utilities all the way up until the point where we find a new tenant. Is it worth pursuing that? Or is it better to just get control of your asset back and put a new tenant in there that is going to conform to the lease, is going to pay the rent, and is not going to continue to be a headache? So from my perspective as a third-party property manager, my job is to be the fiduciary to my client, work in their best interest. Their best interest in that scenario, in my opinion, would be a situation where we're just getting control of the unit back, whether it's cash for keys or an early termination of tenancy or an eviction or whatever the case may be. I think we answered that question pretty well. I know that is in terms of lease length, that's, I think, really what the base question is. And in my opinion, it doesn't really matter, because you're still bound to that obligation, whether it's a month by month or whether it's a year by year. And ultimately, if the tenant doesn't move, you're still going to court. And in most instances, if you're telling a tenant that they need to move and they don't want to move, they're not going anywhere. So you're probably going to wind up in court regardless of whether it's month to month or on a yearly lease term.
Right.
Hey, Andrew, I know we're short on time, but you had mentioned this, and I know I have already on this video, cash for keys, and how it's starting to gain some traction here. Could you explain the idea behind cash for keys for those that maybe have never heard it before, or they have heard it, and what does this actually mean?
So this came out of the mortgage industry back around 08, 09, when the world was falling apart during the mortgage crisis. Banks were offering what's called cash for keys to property owners to get them out of the property so that they could get control of the asset back. And it's no different in the rental world. Essentially, what you're doing is you're offering the tenant a cash for keys scenario. I give you money, you get out and I get control of the asset back. In its simplest form, that's what it is. We have an agreement that we use with tenants where essentially they sign a release stating that as of this date and this time, they received X dollars from Own Buffalo. In return, they are terminating their tenancy effective immediately with no rights reserved to the unit or any of the items left behind, and blah, 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 blah. Basically, it gives us control of the asset back so that we can go in, dump all the crap out of that unit, get it turned over, and get it back on the market to find a new tenant.
And
that scenario works maybe 20 to 25% of the time.
Gotcha.
Cash for keys, we don't have a huge success rate on. Okay. We don't necessarily have a set policy on how it works yet either. That's something that we're actually thinking about looking into and putting like a firm policy in place. We'll return your security deposit, or we'll return your deposit plus 1 month of rent or whatever. It has to be enticing enough to get somebody to go. So for instance, in the scenario I mentioned earlier with that tenant that we've been working on the eviction for 6 months, there was no amount of money that she was going to accept to move out of the unit. That was, we're going to have to go through the whole process no matter what. Like, that was made very, very clear to me from day one. So cash for keys is not always the silver bullet, but it's another tool in the toolbox.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think we got time for one more here, and there's one that I did want to get to because this one was pretty interesting. Question from Dolores. I have a lease for a commercial farm property for which a tenant paid 5 years in advance. Third year is arriving, and he wants to end the lease. He has improvements. I guess he has made improvements: greenhouse, fence, storage shed, solar array. That he hopes to sell. Potential owner can remove improvements or may want them to remain and rent land as current tenant is renting. My question, since he has paid in advance, can he sublet or request a refund, or do I start a new lease with the new owner of improvements? And if he doesn't sell improvements and he abandons area, can I claim ownership? So I think Dolores has this big commercial farm property that somebody had been living on for 5 years, wants to leave after 3. I think what she's asking here, one, is the person, since the lease is not up, he's paid 5 years in advance, can he sublet his living area within the property for the remaining 2 years?
Mm-hmm. So I guess it would depend on how your lease is written. So in the world of commercial real estate, the rules are a lot more open to interpretation, we'll say. There's not as much legislation dictating what you can and can't do on a commercial lease as there is on a residential lease. There's an expectation that if you're entering a commercial lease that you know how to do commerce, and that includes understand the terms and conditions of the lease that you're signing. So from that perspective, my first statement would be, what does your lease say? My next statement would be, what does the law say? And my third statement would be, what does logic say? So depending on what your lease says, your lease may say that any improvements that the tenant makes to the property become part of the property, and they can't remove them once they're installed. That's the most typical thing that we see. I have also seen commercial leases that say your FFE, your furniture, fixtures, and equipment, has to be removed when you move out. We want it taken back to white box, which is also very common. More than likely, your lease is going to specify who owns the improvements that are made to the property once they're physically attached to the property. So I would say double check your lease first and see what your lease says. Same thing with regards to the sublet request. And this is something that I think is probably more open to interpretation. If he wants to sublet and you're okay with him subletting, you could do an addendum, giving him the authorization to sublet so long as you have approval over whoever the sublet is, something along those lines. And again, it may already be in their lease that they have the permission to sublet, or that the permission to sublet is not automatically granted and they need to get permission from the landlord in writing. So it really does boil down to, what does your lease say? As far as leasing to the sublet, you're not leasing to the sublet. He's leasing to the sublet. You're the landlord. He's essentially also the landlord, a sub-landlord, if you will. And then the sublet is his tenant. So essentially, as long as your responsibility is to the second person in line, your tenant. Mm-hmm. So that person's the one that owes you money on a monthly basis, not the sublet. That's the person that is responsible for making sure that the unit is being maintained to the standards that you set as the landlord, because now they're in control of the unit, if you will. There's more that goes into it, but realistically speaking, I think that most of these questions are going to be answered in your lease. And if they're not answered in your lease, I think it's probably going to be either a legal question that should be answered with an attorney, or a logic question that you can probably work out between you and the tenant.
I think that's going to be our new 2024 slogan for RentPrep. What does your lease say? What does the law say? What does logic say? I'm gonna put those on coffee mugs, I think.
I wanted to get t-shirts. I wanted to set up RentPrep merch that said lease, law, and logic on it. And I think it'd be good on a t-shirt or a coffee mug.
Or lease, law, or Andrew.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Whatever Andrew says. All right. Well, I think it's 1:55 here in Buffalo, but I think that's good for today. I think that we covered a wide variety of topics. It was, Carlos, awesome to have you on to kind of talk more about the RentPrep product specifically.
Yeah, great appreciate having me.
Besides not wearing the reindeer ears.
Yeah.
Next year.
There's always next
year. But I think as far as questions go, we're good, Andrew.
Okay, great. Give me 1 second. I'm responding to a Facebook comment.
Oh, what do we got?
Somebody was asking if the episode would be up. They missed the first half because of a power outage. They were asking if it would be up after the event. And yes, it will. Actually, you'll be able to find this on the Facebook page. It goes live on the YouTube page, usually a day or two after. And then the audio gets stripped off of this, and that'll be our next podcast as well. So if you prefer to listen to the audio version of this, if you don't feel like staring at our shining happy faces, you can grab that from the pretty much any podcast app. That'll be podcast episode 420, I believe.
Yes.
Perfect.
So, very good. Well, Josh, Carlos, thank you guys for joining me. I hope you guys enjoy your holiday seasons. Hope everybody out there enjoys their holiday seasons. And we will be back in January. We'll be back with another AMA session in January 2024. We have a ton of upcoming content in 2024 that we're super excited to bring to you guys. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can get a hold of us at rentprep.com or on the RentPrep for Landlords Facebook group. Don't forget to check that out if you haven't already. Anything from either of you guys before we wrap up?
No, everything's good on my end.
Enjoy the holidays.
Very good. Go Bills.
Go Bills.